Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Kārlis Bukovskis, and I'm from the Latvian Institute of International Affairs. And it is my sincerest pleasure to chair this session, which is entitled, Are the Constant Crises Toughening Up the European Union? And it is the part of the sixth annual Baltic EU conversations, and this year entitled, Is Europe Getting Better? So we have a bit of a healthcare tone this year. Due to the crisis we meet online, the current COVID-19 crisis struck a year ago, and it was the Baltic EU conversations last year that were hit among the first ones. We had to cancel the event, but this year we came prepared. We learned from the crisis and we adjusted to it, just like the EU at every crisis that it has been facing. And not only we adjusted, we actually went further and became even more ambitious. We pushed the limits and we set a new standard. The three panels, the other two panels, which are in this case strategic autonomy and European neighborhood, are currently taking place in Tallinn and Vilnius, well, respectively. And just like the European Union, when delegating more powers to the EU institutions and inventing new policies and instruments, the European Union is always, in this case, adapting to the new crisis. And we're going to speak on this panel about the importance of the crisis in life and in existence of the European Union. Crisis is a shock at the start, but as humans, we learn to grow out of it, evidently. And then on this note, I actually I want to say that we wrote a book on crisis. It is called Crisis as the Destiny of the European Union, and it is in Latvian. And actually, this is how it looks like. You can see also in the background, this is also the same book. A couple of notes on the book, which I wanted to say in Latvian language, so I will switch to the Latvian language very shortly. Grāmata Krīzes kā Eiropas Savienības liktenis. Nosaukums ir visnotaļ.
The book, Crisis as the Destiny of the European Union, the title sounds very dramatic, but our conclusions are encouraging, because crises are a huge part of the destiny of the European Union, but they do not always have to be destructive. And the book has a clear message, and it includes a list of essays by excellent authors who would discuss the biggest crisis that the EU has faced since Latvia has been a member of it. Mr. Mārtiņš Āboliņš discusses the COVID crisis. Mr. Aldis Austers turns to the economic and financial crisis. Ms. Agnese Lāce turns to the migration crisis. Ilze Rūsa discusses Brexit. Lolita Čigāne discusses the crisis over the rule of law. Aleksandra Palkova turns to the crisis of product quality. Mārtiņš Vārguls turns to the external and military security crisis. And Alisa Krapāna discusses EU and US partnership crisis. This book deals with the crisis and their effects on Latvia, and this gives the book a unique aspect. We are very glad to have worked on it and thought about these crises and to work on it despite of the COVID crisis that has struck us. I invite you all to read the book, but now we turn to our excellent panelists.
After this short break for advertisement, we have a truly inspiring and wonderful cast of experts here today. We have Mihails Kozlovs, member of the European Court of Auditors. We have Lucia Mokra, professor at the Comenius University in Bratislava, and maybe more influentially, chairperson of the board of TEPSA, the Trans-European Policy Studies Association. We also have Antoinette Primatarova, Program Director on European Union at the Center for Liberal Strategies from Bulgaria. And we, of course, also have Korteweg, Head of the Europe in the World Unit at Clingendael, the Netherlands Institute of International Affairs. I'm very happy that you all agreed to participate and that you all agreed to join us in on this discussion. I will initially give each of you 7 minutes for your original remarks, and then I hope for an active conversation with the audience. So audience can send the questions in via Slido as it is listed in the program, and also those who are a bit closer to us can send in any other form you wish and prefer. Panelists, I also encourage you to ask questions and debate between ourselves. Let's have this discussion and an actual conversation. And colleagues, there have been a multiplicity of crises, and they have been in different areas and in different kinds. And the essential question that I was already indicating, what I would like to discuss with you today, what is the thing which all the crises in the European Union have in common? So Mihails, if I may start with you, both 10 years ago and now the COVID-19 crisis introduced economic challenges, right? So in this case, could you please explain what have we learned from the previous crisis and from today's crisis?
Thank you, Kārlis, very much. I hope you all hear and see me. Well, first of all, of course, sincere thanks to the organizers, to the International Affairs Institute, to the Latvian Parliament, to the Commission's delegations, and to other organizers. Let me start by saying that the main question of this panel is very close to my heart, because it invites us to look in the past to draw lessons for the future. And this is exactly precisely what the European Court of Auditors does for the benefit of policymakers and also society as a whole. As Kārlis asked, let me focus on the economic and financial governance in the European Union. And this is really a very interesting policy area, because the European Union has experienced, and I think is still experiencing, a significant transformation in this area. Since late 90s, I think already since late 90s, the EU has been pursuing very ambitious, very proactive cross-border market liberalization, while at the same time the development of the governance mechanisms and supranational institutions to put all these ambitious reforms in place was certainly lagging behind, and it is still the case as we see. I will come to this point later. So the 2008-9 crisis has exposed the weaknesses in the EU financial system, inadequacy of some policy tools, surveillance and regulatory mechanisms, as well as incomplete institutional architecture at that time. And these deficiencies have been widely recognized now, and this is normal. We are all clever to speak about past events, but importantly, they were also quite well known back in time, back in 2000, but for some reasons not acted upon, left unattended. So what the EU experienced in the following years since the start of the crisis was really a profound stress, but the EU responded decisively to address some of them, and it happened often at dramatic, last minute, late night meetings, and I had the privilege to participate at some of those meetings. So the dynamic of this negotiation of the crisis management is really amazing. So what came out of these discussions, out of these reforms, was basically a major project of the banking union, which is still ongoing. The single supervision of the financial sector, major European banks are now supervised by the European Central Bank in a way. Also, there was a framework created to deal with failing banks, because we all remember that failing banks actually, and their link to the sovereign, to governments, was actually a major problem. The EU has also created several institutions, new institutions, and also produced a certain policy response to help member states in difficulties. So we now have for example, the European Fiscal Board. We have a European Stability Mechanism. We have the Reform, Stability and Growth Pact, the European Semester. I mean, I could go on and go on. So we have multitude of new policy instruments and institutions to implement them. You all remember European Central Bank back in time played a major role with its promise to do whatever it takes. And I think this was a promise then, again, back in time, had yet to be mirrored by the governments on the fiscal side. And I'll come later to an assertion that this had happened only recently with the new Recovery and Resilience Fund. And what is, I think, amazing is that all that happened within more or less, 10, 15 years in a setting of 28, 27 now, independent, sovereign national governments, national parliaments with their own dynamics and their own interests. So I think this compressed pace of reform in still a very clearly intergovernmental setting was and is very interesting to look at. As a result, the European economy and the financial sector as a whole have become, of course, more resilient. And this is why, for example, now the banking sector, as we are in the COVID crisis, the banking sector is not part of the problem, but it seems part of the solution. Well, we are still not out of the woods, but it seems to be the case for the time being. And note also that, for example, despite major economic difficulties in member states, many governments can still borrow at very good market rates. That was not the case in the past, if you remember. So I think this also points in the direction that a lot has been learned from the past crisis. So far so good. Let me also be a bit more critical and ask a question whether the European Union used all the opportunities by the previous crisis to solve its issues. And a very brief answer, I think, to this complex question would be that in the years leading to COVID crisis, not everything has worked as it was planned. Not everything was implemented in the spirit of the initial reforms. So, and the reason is that because as the crisis eased or subsided in a way, the momentum for reforms had been lost somewhere on the way. Again, we saw lengthy debates at the European level, but with no far-reaching reforms in the last couple of years. So the European Court of Auditors has done extensive performance audit work on these issues, and just to give you couple of ideas of our conclusions, we saw, for example, very clearly that governments postpone or lag behind in terms of key structural reforms under the European semester, despite all the instruments of peer pressure and existing sanctions instruments that are there in the legislation. The government debt correction and deficit correction paths lagged behind, again, what was agreed. And finally, maybe, although the banking sector is now in a better shape than in the past, still they do rely on the government support. So here we are in front of the new crisis. We have certainly had a lot of achievements, a lot of compressed reforms, integration, but we see that in each and every of these reforms we can find deficiencies, and I see I'm already almost used up all my time, so I will stop here and probably get a little bit deeper in the COVID-related aspects in my next intervention. Thank you, Kārlis, and thanks all for your attention. Thank you.
Kārlis, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you. Mihails, thank you very much for your thorough explanation of the institutional developments and new institutions being emerging because of the crisis in the European Union. I would like to actually use my opportunity to ask a follow-up question, which is a follow-up to a follow-up. Meaning that Martin Čaboliņš also in his chapter for the book that we wrote, but he was participating in the previous panel on the economic development, and he was actually mentioning one interesting aspect, that there is evidence that the European Union comes out of the economic crisis, weaker than other countries or regions in the world. Meaning that the US is always coming out better than the European Union is coming out. So we are kind of celebrating the fact that we have new institutions, our integration is going further, but what about the actual economic competitiveness aspect? Is European Union actually getting better from the point of view of we being strong economy after the crisis? Or there is some truth in the element that some other ones are better prepared for crisis and dealing with them?
Yes, thank you, Kārlis. That's a complex question, because I think all the institutions that are in charge of the economic policy, I mean, the European Commission, European Central Bank, have been pointing out at the recovery that has been taking place after the previous crisis at various paces in various parts of the European Union. Although all in all the EU at an aggregate level is not doing that bad, we see several pockets meaning member states or maybe regions, where the recovery for various reasons lags behind. And part of the answer to this might be really when the sense of urgency is over, you have put an end to a fire, you kind of relax, you relax, and you are in a more like normal mood. And this might have led to the fact that still now, more than 10 years after the financial crisis, we still see, for example, if you look at the government budget and government debt area, very great divergences. And in some member states where debt should have gone down, it actually went up, even before COVID. We see, for example, in the financial sector that in some member states, the issue of non-performing loans and low profitability has not been addressed. Because again, although everybody recognizes, and we have all policy documents and recommendations that are of a peer pressure nature, it is still the case, and therefore now entering into COVID crisis, there is certain divergence among member states, and I would come maybe later to assessment of whether these divergences can influence the recovery after the crisis in the European Union, to what extent these divergences might play out. So I think we are not doing that bad. But unfortunately, as always in the EU, we are a little bit relaxing too much, maybe, and not solving the problems that we all know about. I mean, remember, you yourself remember how many years we have been talking about the need of more investment in research and innovation in the European Union, and I still see basically the same number, the same comparisons to the leading nations in this area, South Korea, Japan, US. So we are still there. Something has to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihails. Lucia, if I may turn to you, could you please explain a little bit and touch upon the EU's role in the rule of law crisis, and maybe in a bit general context, the future challenges to the European Union treaties, especially taking into account how complex the current relationships are, and how complex also already the Lisbon Treaty adoption process was. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kārlis, for the work and also for the
invitation here for organizers for setting these nice talks, even in the online world. So it's I know how challenging it is. So yeah, rule of law crisis and also its impact maybe on the treaties and on the overall functioning of the European Union. Yeah. So we all know that the European Union is based on common values, and together with the Treaty of Lisbon, as you mentioned, the rule of law is explicitly stated there in Article 2. And this is something where the member states agreed that this is like a fundamental basis for our cooperation to be legal, to be legitimate, to work on some basic level of legal certainty, and to generally work on the principles we had agreed at the beginning, even within its predecessor in the European communities before the European Union. But actually, this kind of a constitutionalization of the rule of law in the Lisbon Treaty in 2009 just give us or draw our attention to the pictures where we find out that the rule of law is not actually working in some states, or the states are not able to fulfill this obligation of the rule of law mechanism. I can say the examples which are pretty much known for all of us, like the Roma crisis in France already in 2010, where the European Commission had to initiate the action and initiate the mechanism of talks with the French government because of the problems with the implementation of the directive on free movement of people in the European Union. Then we can continue with the Hungarian crisis that started at the end of 2011 and which had even different implications or lines of the rule of law breach, if I can say, connected with the different freedoms as a freedom of speech, freedom of education, freedom of association, freedom of media, and so on. We can then continue with the Romania rule of law crisis in 2012, with the Poland rule of law crisis connected with the independency of the judiciary, and so on and so on. So I would say like this kind of a formal setting of the rule of law in Lisbon Treaty even help us to understand how much we are on the way to fulfill this obligation correctly. And this is something which cannot be settled like in some very short way. And I would say even that any idea about shortcomings there would not be effective. Why? There should be, setting general principles, not only the rules, how to tackle the rule of law crisis. We already have the mechanism. We already had agreed on the regulation. We already set the legal framework for the rule of law enforcement. But again, we can still see that the rule of law is facing many challenges and problems. And I would like to connect it also our attention with the current COVID crisis. And it's very visible that the governments, many of the governments use the shortcomings, like the justification for the breach of the rule of law. They used the shortened legislative procedure. They substitute the legal power and the legislative competence rather by the executive orders to prevent or just arguing that it's not a breach of rule of law. We, of course, had the legislative process, but in these extraordinary circumstances, an extraordinary situation, we have to act even rapidly. And that's why they used rather some kind of a shortcoming of the extraordinary procedure or the decision of the executive bodies instead of the proper legislation. And this really raised the question of the rule of law, how much we care about the rule of law in the implementation practice. So I would make the point of the distinction between its formal codification and the actual implementation, because that's the issue where we are facing plenty of the problems. And of course, there's no only one and let's say effective solution, but rather we can focus what we can do within the European Union for its effective implementation, even if its implementation is connected with other crises. no matter whether economic, financial, pandemic, health crisis, or any other crisis. The rule of law as the fundamental value had to really be properly exercised, and of course not only guaranteed by the EU law, but also enforced by the EU law. And here comes the problem from my perspective, and that's the capacity or competencies the EU institutions have in enforcement of the rule of law. We know that the Commission is in charge of enforcement of the rule of law, but actually we have to be aware whether Commission has the capacities. I mean, like how many concrete people, departments, and professionals are able to deal with the rule of law enforcement. The mechanism set in the Article 7 requires the notifications, warnings, negotiations at the time for the response from the national governments, and then it requires the approval from the parliament to get to the Court of Justice, to the enforcement mechanism. And we are quite aware that this is the problem. This was the problem with the Polish sue, or the sue from the Commission to the Poland. This was also the big discussion in relation to Hungary. So what we should, in a way of tackling the rule of law crisis, focus is the Commission's action on the rule of law and the capacity to deal with this crisis and its proper enforcement. So that's one of the point of view. And another one is, and I would like to then somehow connect it with the second question of what we can do later on, is the equality of the member states. Yeah, the rule of law crisis, as I already mentioned, mainly focus the situation in, let's say, still newcomers. Yeah, I mentioned Hungary, Poland, Romania, a little bit less like a French crisis and so on. So the member states, for the proper implementation, have to really focus on the equality of the member states. And these member states are those which are setting the rules and which have the competence even to set the rules in the new revisions of the treaties, which will be probably the issue of the incoming years because of the enlargement process, because of the other crises connected with the development in the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucia, very much. A follow-up question immediately, if I may. A quick one. Is it over? Basically, what I mean is that we have seen, first of all, and what you were already explaining, and we have seen the reactions from the Hungarian government, we have seen reactions from the Polish governments, and they're always arguing that this is interpretation, and what they're doing is actually not going against the principles of democracy. And then we have, of course, different international organizations stating that they are already consolidating their authoritarian regimes and whatnot, again dramatizing the situation maybe. The question is that we also saw in December last year the multi-annual financial framework adopted with this principle in it, although again, as you correctly explained, it's in a very vague and a very complex manner how it can be implemented. So my question is well, it's a short one, but it's not a simple one, I guess. Is it over? Or can we expect that there are going to be some new rule of law type of crisis in those two countries, or maybe in any other countries which are in the European Union?
I would say it's not like a short crisis, so it's lasting. And with this pandemic, it even prolonged its existence. So I mean, like we very or harder can focus on the value-oriented policies, which are based on the rule of law, democracy, and human rights, when we are facing the economic impacts of the pandemic crisis, of the cooperation of the member states. So even if the Commission had the ambition in this term to deal with the rule of law properly, I mean, like really focus, monitor, and enforce it against the member states, their capacities are limited because of the exercising of the other competencies. So it's not definitely over, and I would say that it will last longer than we had expected, and even the Commission had expected in monitoring of the situation in member states.
Thank you, Lucia, very much. Antoinette, if I may turn to you now. about the aspect of joining, leaving the EU integration. How complex has it become to be in the true core of the European Union, institutionally, politically, and also economically, right? Versus against a country who has been deciding to leave the European Union, who has decided to stop integrating and then leave the project altogether because it feels like the European Union is dragging it back. So could you please address these nuances?
We are now almost heading towards 5 years since the referendum in the United Kingdom decided that the United Kingdom should leave. And Brexit was at the time perceived as the biggest crisis ever. Although we have to remember that every time a crisis, maybe not the rule of law, but for example, 2005, the referenda in France and the Netherlands were easily described as the biggest crisis ever. So, of course, it was a very different crisis than the other ones, but I think it was essential, and it relates to the question you are posing. Brexit was important because it did show that the European Union is not so much a construction, this metaphor of building a house and putting the last cornerstone or the roof, but that it's really a modus operandi. And what the Brexit did show was that the house did not collapse. The metaphor of construction site, which heading for the roof doesn't work, and it continued to work quite well as a modus operandi, but not in the way many expected. I think it's very interesting to see that some months after the referendum in the United Kingdom, the Commission came out with its white book, which is now almost forgotten, with all the scenarios, and then later on, Jean-Claude Juncker coming up with his 6th scenario. And now we are heading towards the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was called Conference 2020, but we are now in 2021. And I think it's very much déjà vu. It's feeling for me like experiences all the enthusiasm of going into deeper integration back in 2000 with the convention and then the treaty and the referendum. And it's as if this is forgotten, the scenarios of Juncker are forgotten and of the Commission. And now we are heading for maybe trying to put more and more changes to the treaties, which I think would be disastrous, because I think if we try to change the treaties now, we would immediately actually end up with the disaster of 2005. And I think this is the big problem with the European Union, that we are separating the question of the European Union from member states. We are always asking the question, is the European Union doing better? Does it deliver, or does it not? But we are not always, of course, it was mentioned with regard both to the banking union and to the rule of law, that what matters is what happens in member states. And we see that we have a lot of deficiencies in member states, but member states, of course, are inclined to blame the European Commission and the European Union and to take them as the scapegoat. So I think that after Brexit, for example, one of the consequences is that one of the issues which was considered the core of the European Union, Schengen, it did collapse at the moment, but for obvious reasons. I mean, during the pandemic crisis, when countries introduced restrictions to the free movement within the country, sometimes within the provinces, within the cities, we can't expect Schengen to function as it was. So in this respect, of course, it's very difficult to talk about making Schengen functional again, or for example, for a country like Bulgaria, which actually is still not part of Schengen. It's the moment is not the right one to pursue this goal. On the other hand, just the challenges of the different crises have inspired some countries to come closer to the core. And here again, I can give the example of Bulgaria with regard to the banking union. Bulgaria is so eager to be in the mainstream of the European Union and to join the Eurozone once it is possible, so that Bulgaria agreed to, in order to get admitted to the ERM2, it joined the banking union, which is, and Croatia as well, which is unique. So actually the mood of crises has sometimes made certain moves in member states easier to move closer to the core. So there's no general answer to say, is it now, what does it require to become a core country of European integration? It's very much up to the countries themselves. But I think in general, Brexit made the mood for integration stronger all over Europe now. Of course, there are always speculations about which country might be the next to leave the European Union, but I don't think that the mood for leaving the European Union is strong just now. And I want to end up this just a few introductory remarks with reminding an aphorism by Voltaire that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think that this is the problem with the European Union. We all the time are arguing that the European Union is not delivering. What could it do? But actually, I think it's delivering quite well in all these crises, but of course it's not perfect. Of course, it could be always better. But what I miss in our debates is not that we don't ask simultaneously with the question, could the EU do better? We do not ask the question, would a certain member state, my member state, or member states in general do better without the European Union? And that we do not ask the question, could my member states do better? And if we don't ask these three questions simultaneously, could the EU do better? Could my member state, my country do better? Could every member state do better without the European Union? Then we have a debate which is not well balanced, and we ask the wrong questions. So because the general question in the panel and in your debates was, is the European Union getting better? I think in a way it's the wrong question. It's quite good, it will be not perfect. And you asked also a question whether there is a crisis which could put an end to the crisis in the European Union. I think of course not. We will always have challenges and they are not, I mean, there will be always challenges that are not predictable. There are some which are man-made, but there are many which are not predictable. And that's why I would insist on considering the European Union as a modus operandi and not as a construction site and asking all the time when I'm going to put the roof to the house.
Thank you, Antoinette, very much. I think we're going to go still back to the question at some point, if there could be the dramatic point when we reach the moment when the crisis is too big for the European Union to handle. But that's not what I wanted to ask immediately. I wanted to follow up on what you said, that the mood currently for leaving the European Union is not strong. But from the other point of view, and this is going to be a very provocative question, but it's kind of a question which has been lingering in the air for very many years, if not even decades sometimes. Will it be easier now to integrate for the other European Union member states? Will it be easier now for the European integration project now when the United Kingdom has left?
I think it's the wrong question. And we see that many have taken the United Kingdom as the scapegoat. There were, in some countries, okay, on the one hand, people were talking it might be the end of the European Union as such. But on the other hand, there were some which were hoping that now finally we can go for a deeper integration. And if we look now, it's 5 years since the referendum. And of course, they really left just few months ago. Except for defense, I would not say that they have been big leaps towards deeper integration. And I think the whole debate about deeper integration is too much actually linked to the idea that the European Union has as a final destination to become a federal state. And personally, I think this is wrong. And that's why I think that we will get more cooperation with the European Union, but not necessarily in the framework of a federal state with an ever stronger European Parliament and European Commission. I think that just this opposing member states to the European Union and saying that the solution is a deeper integration somehow at the expense of a weaker role for member states, I think is the wrong way to consider the future. I think really we have to ask much more the questions about what member states are delivering and how they are delivering.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Rem, finally, we have now, the three previous panelists discussed multiplicity of crises that have been there, how they have affected the global role of the European Union. There has been damage done by the migration crisis, by Brexit, by the economic and financial crisis, the rule of law crisis, and internal problems in the European Union itself. What is the current state of the image of the European Union in the world affairs?
Thank you very much, Kārlis, and it's great to join this conversation and to be in Riga, albeit virtually. I want to answer your question by taking a look at how the crises, to what degree Europe has actually been able to manage its crises. Because I think that's really informative in also how Europe is being viewed from the outside. And so when I look at Europe's response to the multiple crises that we've already been talking about just now, you can categorize them as the good, the bad, and the uncertain. And just to look at them very briefly, we have seen European crises where the end result was actually a show of European unity. And that, of course, expresses itself also internationally as a net positive, as a way in which the EU is able to resolve its crises. I think a very clear example of that, and Antoinette mentioned it just now, is Brexit, and particularly the Brexit negotiations. I think looking back at the Brexit negotiations, a lot of people were worried that it would be difficult for the 27 to maintain a common united front, that they would be unpicked by the United Kingdom, or that they would fall head over heels in terms of trying to negotiate side deals with the UK to get extra preferential market access or to soften the European negotiating mandate. And in fact, what we saw is that Brexit, although it was a crisis for the EU, actually became a symbol of European unity. And I will get back to that later and actually say that to some degree, this is a template for how Brussels is also potentially thinking about its crisis management moving forward. Another area where I think we saw stronger cohesion inside the European Union in a time of crisis, rather than perhaps what people expected, has to do with Russia's sanctions policy. I think Russia's sanctions policy is an incidence where people were suggesting that it would be much more difficult for the European Union to maintain a common agenda, to maintain a common front. And that hasn't materialized. Now, there are deep problems with Europe's response to Russian challenges, and I'll get to that. But the fact that Russian sanctions policy has simply been rolled over, and it's been being rolled over quite inconsequentially, there's not huge debate about this, I think shows that there is definitely some resolve inside the EU to keep that going along. I think a third area, which you could call the good, is the decision on the Next Generation EU fund. I slightly disagree with Antoinette that I think that if the UK was still inside the European Union, that Next Generation EU would not have happened, or at least not in the way in which it's now taken shape. I think that Next Generation EU is, to a certain degree, a real strong step in economic integration, possibly the greatest step in economic integration since the introduction of the euro. But the jury is still out on how it's actually going to be implemented. But the fact that we had 27 countries, including very critical countries like my own, the Netherlands, signing up to this, I think is a result that we should embrace. Also, I mean, Valdis Dombrovskis spoke this morning about EU trade policy. I think the global trade system is definitely in a state of crisis, but Europe has presented itself as one of the solutions to this. And of course, this is because trade policy is an EU competence. It's been able to act quite coherently and quite assertively, but it is showing its trade muscle. It's showing leadership at the global stage in terms of moving trade policy forward. It's introducing trade enforcement instruments, so it's also kind of beefing up its role. I think that also shows that Europe is definitely taking serious from the outside on this. But now turning to what you could call the bad, or areas where crises actually show European disunity and which harms our image abroad. I think the euro crisis in sort of 10 years ago is a very clear example of that, and we've already talked about that a little bit. I won't dwell on it. I think the migration crisis really showed that there are big cleavages inside the European Union, and that there's still real room for tension. Also, the current vaccine procurement mess doesn't show the European Union in its strongest light. And I think that this is really something that we need to learn lessons from moving forward. The biggest category of crisis, I think, is uncertain, where it's still, the jury is still out in whether it's going to show European strength or European weakness. We've already talked about the rule of law crisis. In my mind, that hasn't been resolved yet. It's taken serious in some quarters, but it's definitely something that's still festering underneath the surface and could potentially really drive a wedge through the European Union if not resolved. And Lucia has already been talking very eloquently about this. I think Next Gen EU, how it's going to be implemented, look at the problems we currently see in Italy, is still a deeply controversial tool, particularly because of the oversight that's given to not just the European Commission, but to other member states on each other's public finances. I think really the jury is still out, and this is going to influence the way in which the EU is perceived. Migration, same story. Are we out of the woods? I'm not sure. Euro crisis still going on. And so for me, the bottom line of this, looking at these crises, is that what they all have in common is that they force the EU to look inward more, to be focused inward, rather than engaging with the outside world. And this is the long run-up to answer your question. At the international level, in terms of foreign policy, we also have tremendous challenges. And we have challenges when it comes to our China policy, on developing a coherent approach to Russia. We've just seen a dramatic press moment between Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and HRVP Borrell. We have huge challenges when it comes to formulating a coherent response to many of our neighbors, not just Russia. What do we do with Belarus, Turkey, the United Kingdom? It really requires coherent European action, and in fact, we don't have that. What makes things, I think, even particularly challenging is that in times of crises require political leaders to act. Things are bumped up to the level of heads of government. They become Chefsache. But our political leaders, they also play to national constituencies. So institutionally, this is a huge challenge for the European Union. If every crisis requires actions by prime ministers or presidents, then you will see a certain amount of rigidity in our ability to respond. And if we know anything from previous crises, is that rigidity is the enemy of an accurate crisis response. So drawing from these lessons, I think the main question for the EU is whether it will require the EU to move together as one, or whether we're going to build in more degrees of flexibility in how member states and how European institutions respond to different crises. In the area of foreign policy, we're already slowly moving in that direction. There is a debate that we shouldn't have unanimity in all areas of foreign policy making, particularly when it comes to sanctions. We are introducing QMV. We are seeing HRVP Borrell being much more assertive rather than waiting for the 27 member states to sign off on a statement. And so the EU as such is trying to be more flexible. But I don't think we're there where we need to be. I would finish off with one final comment, and that is the EPC, a think tank in Brussels, came out with a very interesting paper yesterday or the day before, where they talk about how the European Union should respond to this period of what they call perma-crisis. And they also raise this example of what they call the Barnier method. So Brexit, of course, is unique, but the way in which Michel Barnier and his task force kind of dealt with this, and also how a semi-political leader was given a very robust mandate with the necessary flexibility by the member states to negotiate, to work on this particular topic, and very importantly, also reach back and keep national governments and national parliaments involved with what he was doing, proved a recipe for success in terms of Brexit. Now, that might be a model to follow when it comes to other external crises. Should we have a task force on Russia? Should we have a task force on Belarus or on Libya or on trade issues in general? It becomes problematic, and this model cannot be followed for domestic or internal crises. For instance, rule of law. You can't imagine a Barnier-like figure dealing with rule of law internally. But on the external front, I think we're learning the lesson. Internally, we still have major challenges to work through, and this period of crisis won't go away anytime soon. So I'm slightly pessimistic about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much about this. This is truly wonderful insight. While people are writing their questions or raising their hands, or those who are participating as attendees, a follow-up question, literally a follow-up question on what you said the last point, is that we are dealing with domestic crisis, and so outside we are doing rather okay. My question is, everyone still sees the European Union, meaning the third countries, see the European Union as a nice place, right? We still have, I'm sorry for the cynicism in this case, but the migration crisis is still unresolved, but it is largely because people are willing to come to the European Union. We have seen a lot of people who are coming and studying in the European Union. We have seen the European Union used as an example. We still have multiple countries who are willing to join the European Union. So basically, we domestically, when we are looking at our own world, we are actually looking not at the whole world. We're just looking from our perspective, so to speak, that we have a problem here and a problem there. But would you agree with this?
No, I think that's true, and I think what I've tried to articulate also is that what the crises do is that they focus Europe inward. We are very good at talking about ourselves. I mean, we're doing it today as well. It's almost the European ailment, that our tragedy, that we tend to, and I'll immediately say that I'm also debit to this, but we focus on our failings rather than on our strengths. We focus on what the things that divide us, the issues that divide member states, rather than on what actually makes us very attractive. And still, to your point, very much a beacon or an example for other parts of the world. I think how it resonates in terms of our foreign policy is that we need to realize that while we're talking about rule of law inside the European Union, while we're discussing about relocation and resettlement of irregular migrants and asylum seekers inside the European Union, while we're dealing with this issue of Brexit on our doorstep, there is something major happening on the international level, which is the dominant geopolitical trend, which is also going to shape Europe's future, is how the United States and China are going to, or are not going to, settle their differences. And this rise of China and sort of the emergence of a Chinese century, if you will, has huge implications, not just for Europe's policy. It has huge implications for what we call the West. Is that still a transatlantic construct, or are there different Wests? It has consequences for our value agenda. And we're hardly talking about this because we're very absorbed about the crisis in terms of our checkbook, the Euro crisis, in terms of what my community looks like, the migration crisis. And that I think is a challenge for Europe to be able to be coherent when it comes to its foreign policy and to promote its interests in that new geopolitical surroundings.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have questions coming in from the audience. In this case, I will start with the first one that we have, and let's go back to Mihails as the first one to answer. What do you think has been the most stimulating crisis of the last decade? So I guess the question is, which crisis has stimulated the most of in the European integration?
Thank you, Kārlis. Well, I've been working, since the inception of my career in the field of financial and economic governance. I think we probably still don't know what was or what is or what will be the largest crisis, because I think what we are entering into now is something really unknown. If the previous crises were in a way could have been predicted, and there were signals of, coming from the European Commission, the International Monetary Fund, for example, on the building up of imbalances before the major financial crisis of the past. Simply there was a bit of complacency before that. I remember myself really the Commission really putting a lot of pressure in 2006 and 2007 to member states, and still the reforms that were needed were not conducted. So I think the major test in the coming years would be the moment when we would need to withdraw the support packages, basically coming back to normal after COVID in the field of economic and financial policy, maybe not so much in other policy areas, will be a major test, because this would expose a lot of issues that I mentioned in my first intervention. So I think this, we have to think about it. We have to prepare for that, because it would come, and when it comes, we have to be ready.
Okay, thank you, Mihails. Colleagues, do you have thoughts on which one has been the most European integration accelerating crisis? Lucia?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the one which joined us mostly, and that would be probably the financial crisis, where we definitely received the proof that the economic cooperation help also the smaller states and also the I would say like rather fragile economies to survive without some higher economic damages, because the other crises rather somehow make the distinction between the states. As I mentioned, the rule of law make the feeling that the newcomers or the new members of the European Union are somehow under more as monitoring or supervision than the older states. When we look on the migration crisis, we are back to the issue that it makes the distinction between the countries. So I would say like probably the economic crisis was the one where we had been able to cooperate because it was the common interest, and maybe it was connected with the basic character why we actually started the project of the European integration, the economic benefits. And those political advantages and political cooperation is coming with a harder way because it's based on a different political cultures, while when we come to economy, we have these benchmarks, indicators, which are common for all the member states. But when we are talking about the migrants, we have a different experience, different perception with incoming, outgoing. When we look on the rule of law, it's very similar. As you mentioned, the Polish representatives or Hungarians said it's totally okay, but the other country said it's against the rule of law if you somehow arbitrarily adopt the decisions and change the legislation. So I would say in this manner, the economic was the one which connect us mainly.
Antoinette? The best crisis from the European integration perspective.
Yes, I agree with Lucia's assessment about the financial crisis, but I would say also that we have the crisis where the jury is still out, as Rem mentioned, the new EU generation program for recovery and reconciliation. But here again, for me, the main issue will be how member states will function. Rem mentioned Italy, my country, is also an example where actually everybody agrees that the EU is very generous with its support, but there are very strong doubts what will Bulgaria be able to do with it. So it's considered a big chance, and we are heading for elections. It's quite natural that, of course, the oppositional parties claim that the government will be not able to make the best out of it or nothing out of it. So if it ends up like the cohesion policy, which was meant to be a big leap towards deep integration, then it will be bad news. So here the jury is still out. It might become the big issue for deeper European integration, but we don't know yet.
Thank you. Rem?
Yeah, I want to go back a little bit further in history and to remind sort of listeners that there was a major, horrific geopolitical crisis, which of course jump-started European integration. I mean, the European coal and steel community emerged out of a huge European crisis. And if I'm sort of staying on that geopolitical track, I actually think that one of the developments which we haven't really digested yet, but which I think is changing the attitude of many European political leaders, is what 4 years of Donald Trump have done to our interpretation of what I mentioned last, sort of what the West is. I think there was this tendency, even though everyone kind of looked at transatlantic policy and sort of knew that the United States asked more and increasingly more of Europe to, for instance, pay for its own defense, and that Americans always were there to point out that we had to move faster or to be more coherent. There was always this assumption that in the end, the Americans would have our back. This concept, I think, was challenged significantly by Donald Trump. And 4 years of Donald Trump, you could make the argument, well, you know, he's gone now and we have Joe Biden. But if I even listen to US foreign policy makers today, they will tell you, okay, there's no time to waste, because our moment for rebuilding transatlantic relations or doing things together might actually be a quite fleeting window of opportunity. It might just be 4 years, and if we're unlucky, only 2 years. Who knows what comes after that? In other words, the United States is no longer a certainty in terms of Europe's anchor in the world. And I think this is going to drive a different philosophy, a different mindset of European leaders to look more towards each other. And so I think that this is you know, I think Mihails and Antoinette and Lucia are all right. I mean, they're very important crises in terms of actual driving pragmatic integration. But at the philosophical level, I think there is this growing assumption that amidst a world where you have a rising China, which thinks very differently about global affairs than Europe does, and uncertainty about the United States, that Europe, as a unit of itself, needs to come together more. Now, how we do that, of course, is the challenge. Are we on this one-way road towards Euro-federalism? Probably not. But the assumption that we need to think of ourselves first and then look abroad, I think, is growing.
Thank you, Rem. We have a few questions still and 10 minutes left, so I would prefer to have one more round of questions and answers. In this case, as there are 3 questions, I would like to state all 3 questions and then give floor to each of you, and you just decide whichever question you prefer to answer. I will start with Agnes Salace, one of the co-authors of the book. She wrote in the chat that my question is, and that goes to Rem directly, so I guess you don't have much of the choice. What I mean my question is about crisis labeling, and what I mean with crisis labeling is calling some processes as crisis to promote a quicker decision-making process with a seemingly more legitimacy, but then offering short-term instead of long-term solutions. Especially this would be seen in the context of the migration crisis, crisis in parentheses. How has this crisis discourse contributed to the role and image of the EU in the world? Has it rather strengthened the image of the EU as a crisis manager, or has exposed the weakness and fragmentation of the organization that can be invoked for political gain from the outside? Okay, so that is the question. Then there is another question. We're talking about the crisis and our united actions on how to coordinate and move forward, integrate closer, adjust to changes. But what at the same time, after the largest enlargement, there is still issue with which remains, two-speed or multi-speed Europe. How in the end we are united if the countries are still treated differently? And the third question from my side is going to be very short. Why cannot we integrate without a drama? Please, who wants to go first? Mihails, I would actually prefer you starting. You have about 1 minute if you could pick the question and answer.
Yes, thank you, Kārlis. Well, yeah, probably the last question is, I wouldn't say the easiest one, but probably the one that one could answer in a short, by a short answer. Could we go on without a drama? I think it comes. I would like to use a couple of arguments made by my fellow panelists who said that in times of crisis we look quite a lot, inwards, and I think we forget. And we, push forward quite a lot of our national interests. Some of them might not be even, considered not legitimate, but commensurate with the size of the problem we want to address. So I think if we look a little bit outside and see that a lot has changed in the world during the last 10, 15, 20 years, and some of the panelists mentioned the rising role of China, for example, also more assertive Russia, changing United States. No member state, we have to come to an understanding that no member state can do it alone in any area, even such developed and experienced member states as, I don't know, Germany, maybe France, well-established democracies, but even they need a common area. They need a market. If we speak economics, we need a scale. So and I think we should as people involved in the European affairs should push for this idea. It's not federalism, because federalism, I agree, might not fly, especially currently, but to push this idea that we need scale. because this is the only way for us to survive, first of all, I think, and to thrive in the future, in the kind of globalized but still quite polarized world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihails, Kozlovs. Lucia, Mokra, please.
Yeah, as we have quite a limited time, just let me shortly try to respond. Why integrate without the drama? I would say it's about the articulation and this kind of, let's say, way how we are able to manage to communicate. I mean, like politically, so it's the issue of political culture. It's the issue of the political communication, and still some kind of let's say even fight of political representatives rather than the interest of the states. Because when you look on the interest of the people, when you look on different public opinion surveys and so on, they are supporting the idea of the European integration. They are looking for the benefits the EU is providing to them. But when they should be heard based on their political representatives, they rather focus on this kind of leadership, even fight, the way of presentation of their interest, not in a smoothly, if I can say, way, but rather on this even fighting character of the conversation. So we somehow left the diplomatic language behind, as we know, which is something sensitive and common in international relations, and rather use the terminology which is sometimes even passive-aggressive. So, and it caused the problems at the end, how we are on the same way on the integration there.
Thank you, Lucia, very much. Antoinette, which one you pick?
One of the questions related to two-speed Europe, and of course in new member states, this is an issue for countries which are not in Schengen, not in the Eurozone yet. Of course, this is an issue, and then the question arises that for example, not that much for Schengen, but for example, the Eurozone, that integration might mean integration only for Eurozone countries. This was partly a concern in Bulgaria at the start of the discussion on the next budget and the recovery plan. And now it is gone. But of course, the concern still remains. And that's why I think that, at least in our case, two-speed Europe is considered as not good for the country. So in a way, there is a desire to be part of the mainstream. And but then the problem is in how far this is facilitated by the European Union, by other member states, etc. So I don't think that two-speed Europe is the way ahead.
Thank you, Antoinette. Primatarova and Rem, please, your, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you for Agnieszka's question. The question of crisis labeling is an interesting one, and I think she's right. I think almost, I mean, it's a very eloquent question, and she's almost answering the question by posing it. The fact that developments automatically get this label of being a crisis, an existential threat to the European Union, means that, yes, immediately they do attract the attention of political leaders, and that things become Chefsache, they're bumped up to the European Council, and that measures are taken principally to also avoid them from dominating the headlines. And that, I think, is very clearly the case in the context of the migration crisis. I think that it does deserve the label of being a crisis simply because how the issue resonates in so many capitals and individual member states. This really became a domestic political challenge for the for political leaderships, and because of that, and the solution that was found to deal with the migration crisis, i.e. to push it off of the front pages, was to outsource it. It was a very short-term strategy. The strategy initially was, okay, we need to find a way, we need to update Dublin 3, we need to develop a sensible system of resettlement and relocation. And both those things ran into problems very quickly. Dublin 3, we're still talking about updating Dublin 3. relocation and resettlement, that's still an issue. But it's now no longer a pure full-blown crisis because it doesn't dominate our front pages. Why? Because we have a fairly functional migration pact with Turkey. So we've outsourced the solution, and that creates a vulnerability. It's hugely vulnerable. I mean, we see this. Turkey uses the migration pact as a whip to challenge anything coming from the EU. It wants visa-free access, which the Europeans promised. It wants its 6 billion euros, which it says it never received. Whether this is all true or not is beside the question. It creates leverage for a third country with which we have a very difficult relationship. And so the outsourcing the crisis in the context of migration to Turkey actually sets us up for another very tenuous relationship with one of our neighboring countries. And so I think you're right. That's the short answer. I think you're right. I think this does lead to short-termism. But the rate in which crises manifest themselves is also increasing. Again, this EPC paper I mentioned talks about perma-crisis. I'm sure that your book also talks about sort of the variety of crises that the European Union confronts. And so it's also, I think, I don't know how we get out of this, how we get out of crisis mode.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Korteweg. And just to wrap it all up in 1 minute or less, I think I want to again follow up. This is what I have been doing the whole show, following up on what Antoinette mentioned. I guess a bit of a rephrasing of the old JFK, well, the Kennedy saying that don't ask what you can do for your what the country can do for yourself for you, but ask what you can do for the country. So in this case, the people should be asking what their governments are doing and could be doing for the sake of the European Union. And that actually, again, wrapping it up and thinking about the book, one of the conclusions which somewhat came out was that it's somewhat double standards. Whenever we're discussing the European Union's double standards, the sustainability of the European Union is always tested with every crisis. Unlike the nation states, when they face crisis, nobody is asking, well, should we get rid of the nation state or should we get rid of our state? Then in case of the European Union, very often the question is existential. Do we even need the European Union? And in this case, honestly, and from a humane perspective, I don't think it's just fair. It's a blunt double standard. Anyways, thank you very much. Thank you all the panelists for excellent conversation, excellent discussion. We are continuing the conference at 3 o'clock with a closing keynote conversation on the EU's future and place in the world with José Manuel Durão Barroso, chair of Gavi, and the former president of the European Commission and former Prime Minister of Portugal, and it's going to be moderated by Edis Bosch from the Riga Stradiņš University. Thank you very much and see you.
Thank you. Bye.